The Arizona sun burned hot over the dusty plains, spreading waves of heat that shimmered above the sand like a living veil. Daniel Hayes wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned on the handle of his hammer, his shirt damp and clinging to his back. The fence had been giving him trouble for days: warped wood, rusted wire, and the kind of stubborn nails that refused to sit straight. He squinted toward the horizon, where the land stretched endlessly, dotted with dry shrubs and lonely rocks. This was his life, quiet, repetitive, but peaceful. After his father died, Daniel had taken care of the ranch alone, speaking only to the horses and the wind that carried memories of a time long gone. It was then, while reaching for another post, that he noticed something strange: a flicker of movement near the dry creek bed. At first, he thought it was just a coyote or a jackrabbit. He narrowed his eyes against the sun, shading them with a rough, calloused hand. But the movement wasn't like that of an animal. It was slower, weaker, almost desperate. Daniel set down his tools and began walking toward it, his boots crunching against the brittle earth. The sound of cicadas filled the air, their constant droning blending with the distant whistle of wind. When he reached the edge of the creek, he stopped dead in his tracks. Lying in the dust was a boy, barely 10 years old. His face was pale under the layers of dirt, his lips cracked, and his breathing shallow. The child's clothes were torn and faded, more rags than fabric. His small hands twitched as if reaching for something invisible. Daniel's heart clenched at the sight. He knelt beside him, gently touching his forehead. It was burning with fever. "Hey, son," Daniel said quietly, though the boy didn't respond. He lifted him carefully, feeling how light he was, as if life itself had almost left him. Without wasting another moment, Daniel carried him back to the cabin, his arms trembling not from weight but from the fear that he might already be too late. Inside the cabin, Daniel laid the child on his cot. He fetched a basin of cool water, dampened a cloth, and wiped the boy's face. The child stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering. Daniel poured a cup of water and brought it to his lips. "Easy now," he whispered, tilting it just enough for the boy to sip. The boy drank greedily at first, then coughed, gasping between breaths. Daniel waited, patient, letting him take small sips until the cup was empty. Then he reached for a blanket, wrapping it gently around the trembling body. There was a stillness in the cabin, broken only by the creak of the wood and the crackle of the cooling stove. After a while, the boy's eyes opened, dark and wary. He looked around as if unsure where he was, then fixed his gaze on Daniel. The man offered a small, reassuring smile. "You're safe now," he said softly, but the boy didn't seem to understand. His lips moved, forming words Daniel couldn't catch. Then, in a faint whisper, the boy said something strange, rhythmic, like a prayer. Daniel realized it wasn't English. It was Apache. The sound of it made the air feel heavier. The frontier was full of whispers about raids, about settlers clashing with Apache bands who refused to give up their land. Daniel had heard the stories, seen the fear in other men's eyes whenever the word Apache was spoken. Yet, looking at the boy, fragile and frightened, those stories felt distant, hollow. Daniel sat beside the bed, watching the child drift in and out of sleep. His mind ran in circles. What was an Apache boy doing out here alone? The nearest reservation was miles away. And even if he'd run off, why was he in such a state? Starved, burned by the sun, half dead. He must have been running from something, or someone. Daniel stood and looked out the window. The horizon glowed orange as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the empty land. The wind had picked up, brushing against the tall grass, whispering secrets in a language older than time. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat in his wooden chair by the window, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the darkness outside. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind set his nerves on edge. He wasn't afraid of the boy. No, it was what might be looking for him that troubled Daniel. If there were others out there, family, warriors, they might come searching. And if they found their child in a white man's cabin, things could turn ugly fast. But something deeper than fear tugged at Daniel's heart. The boy had been left to die. No man with decency could turn him away. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the soft breathing from the cot. Daniel thought of his father, of the lessons he'd taught him long ago. A man's worth is measured not by what he owns, but by what he does when no one's watching. Those words echoed now. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, their cries lonely and wild. Daniel rose, checked the door latch, and stoked the fire. The boy murmured something in his sleep, a single word repeated with a tone of pain. Daniel didn't understand it, but he could feel the weight behind it: grief, fear, and loss. When dawn came, a pale light spilled into the cabin. Daniel knelt beside the bed again. The boy's eyes opened, just a little. He looked at Daniel, and for a moment, the fear softened. Daniel smiled faintly. "You'll be all right," he said quietly. "We'll figure this out." But as he stepped outside to fetch more water, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Somewhere beyond those endless hills, something, or someone, was moving toward him. And whatever story this child carried, it was far from over. The Arizona sun burned like a furnace over the endless plains, turning the air into a shimmering curtain of heat. The ground was cracked and pale, the kind that swallowed footsteps without a sound. Daniel Hayes wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned against the fence post, the hammer heavy in his hand. His days were quiet ones, spent fixing, feeding, and fighting the desert that never gave anything easily. He lived alone now, the way the land seemed to prefer, quiet and uncomplaining. The wind carried the faint scent of sage and dust, and the hum of distant insects filled the silence around him. As he bent down to check the next section of wire, something flickered in the corner of his eye. A faint movement, low and slow, near the dry creek bed that hadn't held water since spring. Daniel straightened up, squinting toward it, shielding his eyes against the blaze of the sun. Probably a coyote, he thought at first. Maybe a tumble of brush caught in the wind. But the shape moved again, unsteady, stumbling, almost human. He dropped his tools without thinking, boots crunching on the parched earth as he walked toward the creek. Each step kicked up small clouds of dust that clung to his boots like ghosts. When he reached the edge of the creek, he froze. Lying half buried in dust was a boy, thin as a shadow, his lips cracked and bleeding, his chest rising in weak, shallow breaths. His hair was matted, his skin darkened by the sun. Daniel knelt beside him, heart pounding. He touched the boy's forehead. It was burning with fever. "Hey, kid," he said softly, but the boy didn't respond. His eyelids fluttered like he was caught between worlds. Daniel hesitated only a second before lifting him into his arms. The child was so light, it felt like carrying air. He hurried back to the cabin, kicking open the wooden door with his shoulder. Inside, the dimness was a relief from the blinding sun. Daniel laid the boy gently on his cot and grabbed the water jug from the table. He poured a little into a tin cup and brought it to the boy's lips. "Easy now," he whispered as the boy drank greedily, coughing between gulps. Daniel waited, then offered another sip. When the boy's thirst eased, he pulled an old blanket around him and dampened a cloth to cool his forehead. The boy's small chest rose and fell in quick, frightened breaths. After a few minutes, the boy's eyes opened, dark, uncertain, full of something Daniel couldn't name. "You're all right," Daniel murmured. "You're safe here." The boy blinked at him, his lips moving as if to speak. But what came out was not English. The words were soft, broken, strange to Daniel's ears. He recognized the sound immediately. It was Apache. Daniel had heard the language before, years ago, in trading posts and whispered tales told around fires. He didn't understand a word, but he knew enough to sense fear behind the tone. The boy wasn't just lost. He was running. Daniel sat quietly beside him, unsure what to do next. Out here, in this lonely stretch of land, people didn't just stumble upon one another. The desert was too wide, too cruel. Every life that crossed your path carried a reason, and often a price. Daniel studied the boy, noting the bruises along his arms, the small cuts on his hands. It looked like he'd been walking for days. "What happened to you, kid?" Daniel asked softly, knowing there would be no answer he could understand. The boy stared at him, eyes heavy with exhaustion, and murmured another word that sounded like a name, or a plea. Then his eyes closed, and he drifted back into uneasy sleep. Outside, the light began to fade, turning gold, then red. Daniel stepped to the doorway and watched the sky darken over the plains. Coyotes called in the distance, their cries lonely and sharp. The ranch felt smaller at night, swallowed by silence. He leaned on the doorframe, rifle close at hand out of habit, but tonight there was an unease in him that the gun couldn't chase away. He wasn't afraid of the boy, but of whatever might be searching for him. If there were others, family, or worse, warriors, they wouldn't take kindly to finding their kin under a white man's roof. Still, Daniel couldn't bring himself to regret helping the child. He'd been raised better than that. His father had taught him that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he owned, but by what he did when no one was watching. Those words echoed now, faint but steady. He turned back to look at the boy, asleep under the threadbare blanket. There was something fragile in that small figure, but also something fierce, like a spark refusing to die, even in the cruelest desert. As the hours passed, Daniel sat by the window, watching shadows move across the land. Every gust of wind, every distant sound made him tighten his grip on the rifle. He didn't know what was out there, but his gut told him something would come. Maybe by morning, maybe later, but it would come. The boy shifted in his sleep, whispering something again in that strange tongue. Daniel leaned closer, hoping to catch a word, but all he heard was pain. Soft, broken pain that cut deeper than any language barrier. When dawn finally crept over the horizon, painting the sky in pale blue and silver, Daniel rose stiffly from his chair. The boy was still sleeping, his breathing steadier now. Daniel poured fresh water and set some bread near the bed. He stepped outside, stretching the stiffness from his limbs. The land looked peaceful again, too peaceful. The same dry wind swept across the plain, carrying the faint smell of dust and grass. Daniel knew that soon, he'd have to ride into town, ask questions, maybe find out if anyone was missing a child. But part of him hesitated. Something about this boy, about the way he'd appeared out of nowhere, didn't feel like a simple case of being lost. He looked back toward the cabin, where a thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney. Somewhere inside that small wooden house was a story, one that had begun long before Daniel found the boy, and one that wasn't finished yet. The desert had a way of burying secrets deep beneath its sands. But Daniel Hayes had just unearthed one, and though he didn't know it yet, the next few days would change everything he thought he knew about kindness, loyalty, and the thin line between enemies and friends.